The African diaspora was a movement of Africans and their descendants to places throughout the world, predominantly to the Americas, during the Atlantic slave trade, with the largest population living in Brazil. Over a period of almost 4 centuries, 4 million Africans were transported to the Americas, captured from their homeland and separated from their tribes and families. They were now enslaved Africans in a new world where all familiar customs were absent. These Africans, though scattered and dispersed, managed to retain their traditions and to reform their identities in this new world. Elements of African culture such as religion, language, and folklore endured and were their links to their past lives. A related concept, creolization, is the process of cultural interchange, in this case between peoples of the continents bordering the Atlantic Ocean, and it is an important aspect of the American experience. Language, literature, food, dress, and social relations are all affected by the interplay of cultures. Only recently, though, have scholars fully begun to understand creolization as a mutual exchange rather than the acculturation of colonized peoples such as Africans to the dominant culture. Various scholars have characterized creolization as symbolic piracy, cannibalization, and poaching, instead of the more neutral view of borrowing or conversation between cultures. The African diaspora has received a great deal of attention in current scholarship. Various studies and programs focus on the so-called Atlantic world and the notion of a single African diaspora. There seems to be a general consensus that the so-called Black Atlantic is synonymous with the African diaspora. This course will shift the focus of the African diaspora away from the single study of creolization toward an emphasis on placing Africans and their descendants at the center of their own histories. This means making Africa the starting point for examining Africans and the diaspora, particularly during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. Africans arrived in the various destinations of the colonial world in all of their social and cultural richness, fully informing the institutions that Africans created, and providing them with a prism through which to interpret and to understand their conditions as enslaved Africans and as freed peoples. As the final destination of just over 1 million Africans, Brazil took in more Africans than any other European colony during the period prior to 1770, and the heinous practice was centered in the sugar plantations and gold mines of Brazil. From the arrival of the first large shipment of enslaved Africans to Brazil in the middle of the 16th century until 1770, better than 2 out of every 3 enslaved Africans who arrived in Brazil were of Central African origin. During the 17th century, the percentage was even higher. Peoples within the region shared much in common, resulting in mutual understandings, shared beliefs, values, and customs, both in Africa and in enslaved African communities of the Americas. Despite the overall dominance of Central African enslaved Africans, around 1700 a significant number of enslaved Africans arrived from Lower Guinea and began pouring into Brazil, and their cultural impact is still felt in places like Bahia, Pernambuco, and even Coimbra. Religion is one of the most important facets of any culture, and in these African societies, the relationship between the spiritual world and the temporal world was continuous and unbroken. Therefore, in our effort to make Africa our starting point, we'll now examine specific African religious, cultural, and musical practices. Later, we'll further examine how these practices have survived in the New World and remain a central part of the history of displaced Africans, serving as primary mechanisms for resisting the trenchant conditions of slavery and oppression. First, in traditional African culture, there was no distinction between the sacred and the secular realms of life, nor the material and the spiritual. Put another way, religion represented a fusion of the sacred and the secular, with no distinctions between religion and everyday life. Thus, in traditional Africa, there wasn't even a word for religion, because the Africans' religion permeated and was the basis for all aspects of life: education, politics, harvesting, hunting, homemaking, and community welfare. Second, religion was not systemized into dogmas, but appeared as ideas and practices which governed everyday life in various communities. God was the one, with various mythological lesser figures of a spiritual nature, who sometimes acted as intermediaries between God and the people. Therefore, the African spiritual world consisted of God, lesser divinities or Orisha, the living dead, those who were physically dead, and ordinary spirits. There's a conscious and continual focus on one's ancestors, who after their death are born again, first as living dead in the spiritual world, and eventually they're reincarnated into the physical world. Third, religious beliefs were externally manifested in ritual. The formal trappings of ritual, that is God, lesser gods, living dead, and spirits, came together in communal ceremonies of dance, drum, and song. Fourth, Aish is a Yoruba concept for the universal life force present in all things. Ritualistic singing, dancing, and drumming generated and increased Aish. The Yoruba people believed, for example, that Aish as a life force could be put to good or evil use, and it could be tapped directly from the Orisha, to whom the ritual is dedicated. Fifth is the concept and practice of possession, more specifically ritualistic possession, which was brought about by rhythmic stimulation, such as drumming and chanting, and was an energetic and concentrated combination of dancing and controlled emotional and mental concentration. Therefore, and finally, African music was essentially an emergence of song, dance, and drum, with all three equally contributing to a desired experience and effect. One of the most common ways that Africans explained the world around them was through the ritual of divination. Divination literally means to be inspired by a god, and represents the attempt to ascertain information by the interpretation of omens and alleged supernatural agency, either by or on behalf of a querent or the one who questions in the process. A distinction must be made between divination and fortune-telling, because divination has a formal or ritual and often social character, usually in a religious context, while fortune-telling is a more everyday practice for personal purposes. As we'll continually see throughout this course, Africans and their descendants frequently use various mechanisms to facilitate the collective resistance of slavery and white oppression. The most potent weapons at their disposal were not muscle and might, but religion, ritual, and spirituality. These weapons manifested themselves quite differently in the Southern Hemisphere, or the Southern Americas, than in the Northern Hemisphere. There's little doubt that Africans brought with them a vast and rich cultural, ritualistic, and religious history. At the great risk of oversimplifying these issues, there are various reasons that these histories went underground or vanished altogether at a greater level in the Northern Americas than in the Southern Americas. For example, The cultural heritage brought from Africa by enslaved Africans met with less overt opposition in the southern Americas than in the northern, and that heritage was able to sustain itself for a longer period of time. Also, in the southern Americas, absentee landowners were often more frequent, and many of those had little interest in the leisure activities of enslaved Africans. Additionally, there were frequent influxes of new African arrivals in the southern Americas, with a proportion of blacks to white as high as 25-1. Finally, there were greater and more trenchant efforts to convert Africans to Christianity in the northern Americas than in the southern, thus either eliminating or driving underground any remnant of a rich cultural and religious heritage. As we'll shortly see, Africans in 17th century Brazil utilized a variety of Angolan ritual and religious practices as ways of addressing enslavement and collectively resisting it. In Brazil, African religions were not creolized, but were independent systems of thought, practiced right alongside Catholicism. To the contrary, and coincidentally, whites were sometimes quick to adopt African religious practices in order to address the secular and temporal needs that Christian prayer and faith could not immediately address.